Hello and welcome to Nuclear Energy Information Services Night with the Experts. I'm Gail Snyder, the board president, and I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us this evening. This session will be recorded, just so you know, and we ask that everyone keep themselves on mute unless we ask you to unmute yourself when it comes time to ask questions. So our night with the experts, we do something we call flipping the script. So we allow our expert about 20 minutes to speak on the topic, and then we turn it over to you to ask the expert questions. So giving people the majority of the time to ask questions, and that'll be done through the chat, and we will explain that later. So tonight we want to welcome our speaker, which is Kate Brown. Kate Brown is an MIT professor, and she is the Thomas M. Seibel Distinguished Professor in the History of Science. And tonight she'll be speaking on the Chernobyl disaster is not mankind's greatest nuclear disaster. She is the author of Plutopia, Nuclear Families, Atomic Cities, and the Great Soviet and American Plutonium Disasters, and Manual for Survival, a Chernobyl Guide to the Future. What do we know about the Chernobyl disaster? Working through Soviet archives, historian Kate Brown encountered many contradictory accounts of the catastrophe and its effects. Local doctors reported a public health disaster among people exposed to Chernobyl fallout. International experts contest that claim, realizing that although people and archives lie, trees probably don't. Brown turned to scientists, biologists, foresters, physicians, and physicists to help her understand the ecology of the greater Chernobyl territories. She learned that contaminants saturated local ecosystems long before the Chernobyl accident and continued long after the 1986 event. Brown argues that to call Chernobyl an accident is to sweep aside the decades of radiation exposure that rained down on the globe during the period of nuclear testing. Instead of a one-off accident, Brown argues that Chernobyl was a point of acceleration on a timeline of radioactive contamination that continues to this day. And then speaking with Kate before we started, she does want to talk about what is happening in Ukraine with the nuclear power plants in a war zone, which would be this considerable acceleration of a timeline. We hope it doesn't occur where there's a radiation exposure. So Kate, I want to welcome you if you'd like to unmute. And if there's anything you want to add to your intro that you think is pertinent, please do and go ahead.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Gail. And thanks everyone for joining me tonight. I'm going to share my screen and show you a PowerPoint. And I'll keep this quick because I do want to hear from you. But, February 24th, 2022, the war of 2022 began and Russia attacked Ukraine. And one of the first places they made a beeline for was the Chernobyl zone. And this is sort of an incredible, like, what would they want to be doing there? And the guy who was the shift, was the head of the shift when the Russian army was coming over the horizon, called his supervisor in the town of Slavutich, where the nuclear workers lived. And he said, there's nothing in the manual to tell me what to do when an army attacks the installation. There's no protocol for this. And that, was an amazing thing. The Russian army came, the Ukrainians immediately stepped down. There was a security detail at the station, but they didn't shoot because they understood what would happen if somebody started shooting around a decommissioned nuclear power plant. The Russians held this site for nearly a month. They did some incredible things, which I think tells you about how little we have come to understand in the general public about Chernobyl. They put a battalion of Russian soldiers in one of the most radioactive sites on Earth, and that's the Red Forest, which is what took the biggest cloud of radiation from the burning Chernobyl plant, and it's called the Red Forest because there was a forest of commercial pine trees, and the trees turned red from the exposure to radiation. Pine trees are very vulnerable to radioactive exposure. They turned red and they died. And so I thought everybody knew about the Red Forest, but the Russian army, the officers had these soldiers camp out in the Red Forest. They started to dig trenches. After about a month, they were getting, they got a lifetime dose. They got enough dose to make people sick. They got a dose that will kill 50% of the people who are exposed to that kind of dose. And some of the soldiers started to, have the classic radiation symptoms, nausea, they lost their hair, they finally went on strike and demanded to leave, and they left. And one guy, several people were checked into the radiation hospital in southern Belarus in Gomel, and reportedly one guy died. That has not been confirmed, but that's what the Ukrainian sources say. So to me, this situation speaks of the really dangerous price of selling the Chernobyl accident as, oh, world's greatest nuclear accident, and only 33 people died. We can live with those kinds of statistics, that kind of exposure. That, as I worked my way, as I wrote this medical and environmental history of the aftermath of Chernobyl, I found that to be a very closely crafted, manufactured mistruth, created by officials in Moscow who were in collaboration with international scientists working for the UN and for French and American and British nuclear regulatory agencies. And so let me tell you, this is some of the trees from the Red Forest. And, if those soldiers had been ecologists, had they been trained to read the landscape like biologists do, they would have noticed as they burrowed into the Red Forest some really strange things, like there were no insects or worms in the soils that they dug into. As they cut trees, they would have seen these characteristic marks, that line between the light colored tree rings and the redder colored tree rings is a line that marks 1986. They would have noticed that the leaf litter was really high, because nothing's decomposing. They would have found trees that were cut down in 1986 that were still sitting there, undecomposed, because there aren't enough living microbes and beetles and insects in the Chernobyl zone to do, especially in the Red Forest, to do the kind of work of decomposition that we normally expect in natural sites. So I think most of you probably know the bare bones of the Chernobyl accident occurred April 26th, exactly, what do I want to say, 31 years from, when was that? In 1986, and now we're in 22. I can't do the math right now, but we're on that anniversary a month ago today. And the Chernobyl reactor exploded, and then it exploded again. It released between 50 million and 200 million curies of radioactivity. That's an awful lot of destructive energy. The Russians declared a zone of contamination, what we know today as the Chernobyl zone. And in the course of the next 2 weeks, they depopulated the zone, removing 120,000 people who lived in that territory. I'll give you a couple of the greatest hits I learned while I worked on this, worked my way through the medical and the Ministry of Health records and the Ministry of Agriculture records in the former Soviet republics. 3 days after the accident, a big storm front was brewing, with thunderheads. And so from Moscow, and the wind had shifted to the northeast. So that storm front was going to threaten to rain radioactive waste on the big Russian cities, including Moscow. So from Moscow, some planes went up, they seeded the clouds, and they let it rain on rural Belarus in order to save urban Russia. And you can see here from this radiation map, this is from 1986. The Chernobyl zone is right here. This is a map of Belarus. And you can see these angry red areas. This is the Chernobyl zone today. The pilots held off after they went over the big city of Gomel, about 500,000 people, and they let it rain here in southern Belarus, where 200,000 rural people, mostly farmers and foresters, lived. And you can see these angry red spots are nearly as hot as at the Chernobyl zone itself, as ground zero. This was a triage operation. They saved millions of people in the big cities, this contamination. The only problem is they didn't tell anyone in Belarus they had done this, not even the chairman of the Belarusian Communist Party. So this area down here was evacuated within 10 days. This area here, people lived in for the next 14 years. And it wasn't, it still has people living in it, but most of the people were gone by 1999. And so when we talk about health effects, a lot of them are occurring in this Mogilov province of Belarus. The Soviets said, you know, we tested the food and we found it to be perfectly safe. As I went through the Ministry of Agriculture records, I found that almost all food, this is an agricultural region, almost every food that they tested was radioactive, and a lot of it was highly radioactive. One stories that I found really amazing is about 100,000 head of livestock got sick because they were underneath these clouds of fallout. And so the soldiers came in and they slaughtered 100,000 cows and sheep and goats. Then in the correspondence you see, well, what are we going to do with all this meat? Meat in the Soviet Union was a delicacy, was a rarity, and it was very valuable, and they hated to throw it out. So there was a manual, and that's why I call my book A Manual for Survival. I found all kinds of new manuals, probably the first ever in human history of how to live in a post-nuclear zone. And so there's a manual from the meat packers, and it says, take the meat and grade it, high, medium, and low levels of radiation. The low and the medium levels, mix it with clean meat, make sausage, and spread and market it, label it as you normally would, and send it all over the Soviet Union. Just don't send any of that sausage to Moscow. The high level meat, put in freezers and wait for it to decay. Pretty soon at that Gomel meatpacking plant, I see that they're asking over and over again for more freezers. They don't get enough freezers. They finally get a refrigerated train car and they shove in 60 tons of high-level radioactive meat, and they sent it to Baku. In Baku, the Geiger counters went off and they rejected the meat, and they sent it on to Yerevan in Armenia, and so on and so forth. For 4 years, this radioactive ghost train circulated the western half of the Soviet Union until finally in 1990, the Ukrainian KGB buried that whole train and the now decaying, in both senses, radioactive meat, they buried in the Chernobyl zone of alienation. The Soviet officials, I found some strange things that didn't really line up. Like you see here, this is a map from 1989. This is the Chernobyl region right here. Here's this town, Chernigov. It's been in the press a lot because it was heavily bombed by the Russians in the last couple of months. But Chernigov, you can see, didn't get much radiation. The clouds of fallout missed them. But I found that there was a list of women, workers at a wool factory, who got status as liquidators. Now, liquidators were people who had documented exposures from helping to clean up the Chernobyl accident. So I was wondering, like, how did that happen? We think of liquidators as the firemen and the nuclear power plant workers who sort of, went in and fought those radioactive flames, not female textile workers in a clean town 50 miles away. So I tried to find some more information, and finally I rented a car and I drove up to Chernigov, and first I talked to the management, and they said, yeah, we had a problem in 1986, and a commission came from Moscow, and we changed our process, and the wool was clean and problem solved. So I asked, I've often found over the years as I've worked that management doesn't always tell you the full story. So I asked if I could go down the line and see the works. And on the line, I found women who were still there at their wool sorting tables. And these were women, they picked themselves out of the list. They're like, that's my name, that's my name. And there are 10 of the 200 were left. And I said, well, where's everybody else? And they said, oh, well, they've either died or they've been invalided out on pensions. And as the women talked, these women, they cleaned dirty wool for a living. Most of them didn't have high school degrees, but they knew an awful lot about radioactive isotopes and about nuclear medicine. They pointed to which parts of their body were diseased and or ached, and they knew which radioactive isotopes lodged in which kinds of organs. They were quite accurate about that. And they also asked me, they said, you know, what do you think happened to the, sure, we got our wool clean, but what do you think happened to the wastewater that left this plant? Did you ask the management about that? And I said, no. And they said, well, why don't you go check on that? And so I went back to the archives, and what they told me was absolutely true, that the radioactive wastewater went into the drinking reservoir for the town of Chernobyl. Moscow officials also said that they gave medical examinations to 900,000 people, and they found no changes in health statistics. I went through the Ministry of Health records, and we got down with a couple of research assistants. I got down to the county level hospital records. And we found, you know, the official count was that 600 people were hospitalized. These were mostly firemen and nuclear power plant operators were hospitalized because of the accident. That was a count from just one hospital, the radiation medicine hospital in Moscow. We found, looking through all the records, that 44,000 people were hospitalized in just the summer after the accident for radiation exposure, 11,000 of whom were children. And you know, people, when we start to look at the medical records, it was socialized medicine. So they just had a sort of a normal everyday epidemiology where they just kept records on everybody who came into the clinics. And we find really alarming rates of changes in health, changes in fertility and women's ability to carry babies to full term, perinatal deaths, birth defects. Children, and especially pregnant women, were hit hardest. Kids had, you know, these kind of strange skin rashes and allergies, you know, autoimmune disorders, digestive tract disorders. Almost 50–60% of the people got sort of what we call a radiation pneumonia. Cancer, people getting cancer treatments often have a radiation pneumonia that they just could not get rid of. So lung disorders and, you know, chronic diseases. And these problems persisted. And let me see, these are two, a couple of years later, cancers start to emerge, first leukemias after about 18 months, and then after about 3 years, thyroid cancers. And these two individuals are just post-op from thyroid surgery. The boy you see on the right, you can see also has some growth hormone issues as well. Here's a record, the kinds of records we were looking at. This says here that we looked at, you can't see it up here, but it says that we looked at 1,521 kids. Of those 1,521 kids, 1,132 had one chronic disease or another. And that's what we find that shifts after 1986. Before 1986, about 90%, 80–90% of the kids were deemed healthy. And I don't know who's drawing on that, but that's pretty amazing that somebody can draw on that. And after 1986, by about 1988, 80–90% of the kids had one chronic disease or another, and often kids had multiple diseases. Here's a chart that shows chronic anemia among kids in Belarus. And you can just see this chart from 1986 to 1989, just, you know, looks like an arrow going into space. You know, there was a lot of controversy in the archives. You know, Moscow officials and international officials were saying everything was fine. Doctors closer to the ground were saying we were having a public health emergency, and those are the words they used. So I wasn't sure who to trust. And so, as Gail said in the introduction, I was like, well, you know, people lie, therefore archives lie, but what about the natural environment? Perhaps trees don't lie, you know. And so I called up these two biologists, the only two biologists I could find who consistently work in the Chernobyl zone. They go twice a year, every June, every September, and they carry out, since the 1990s, they've carried out a series of experiments. And they do this in this, you know, the Chernobyl plant is right about here in the Plutopia marshes. This is Europe's largest marsh. It's kind of the Amazon forest of Europe. It's the most biologically diverse region of Europe. It's a big sandy bowl of land transected by 17 rivers that break up into hundreds of lakes and swamps and streams. It's absolutely beautiful zone. Nuclear power plants need water. The Pripyat marshes served up a lot of water. So I wanted to understand the ecology of this zone. So I asked a forester first to take me through it. And there was one part of the zone that the Soviets had turned into a Air Force bombing range. It hadn't been dried up to make way for agriculture. And so I took a tour through it, and we looked at a lot of spent ordnance, and we went to a village that had been there before it became a bombing range, and all that was left was a cemetery. And I noticed in this cemetery that there was a bomb crater with some pine trees growing out of it. Now, this bombing range was founded in 1961, and I looked at these pine trees, and I see these weird mutations that I knew were, all pine needles are supposed to go straight, and they're supposed to go in the same direction. And when they don't do that, biologists call them disorganized. And you see right here, Michael Lee, you can point out this little curly one here. What was that? I didn't know somebody could write on a PowerPoint. I think that's really cool. But you see this right here. And I pointed out to the forester, and I said, like, how old do you think these trees are? And he said, oh, about 40, 50 years, which would have predated Chernobyl. And that really got me curious. This pine tree sort of was my first clue into learning how to read environments like we do texts. And I went and I looked up, and I found this study made in the 1960s by this series of Russian radiation ecologists, who showed that they said this came from fallout from American bombs, radioactive cesium. And here they're counting radioactive cesium, and they find these really hot spots. That's about where I was standing. And then these whole areas here, when they found that, the soils and water and plants and animals and humans who lived in the Pripyat marshes had elevated levels of radioactive cesium, 10 to 30 among the humans, 10 to 30 times more than people who lived in nearby Kiev and in Belarus. Now, this is 20 years before they opened that Chernobyl plant. And that's really astounding. And that's when I started to think about this. It's like we often focus on accidents and, just the chronology of the immediate accident. But what I think Chernobyl tells us is that this bog was first irradiated long before the Chernobyl plant was ever built. And as we see today, as there's all kinds of problems with the war.
There is somebody that is drawing very inappropriate things.
I think we're being hacked here. Let me stop my share. And I'm going to conclude with unreinforced, just regular buildings like a Costco warehouse kind of building, and in those those basins with radioactive fuel is tremendous amount of radioactivity. When we saw in March of this year, when the Russians took over in a battle, the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, one of Ukraine's largest nuclear power plants, we came within a hair's breadth of having a much larger nuclear accident than Chernobyl. Now, Chernobyl had only been in operation 6 years when it exploded. So that meant that fuel was relatively young, relatively clean. Young means clean, without any spent fuel rods like we saw with Fukushima nearby the plant. But what they found in Zaporizhia is that there had been a Russian missile had landed right in one of the electrical transmitters, and it had lodged there and not exploded. They were using some old fuel that was from the Soviet days, old missiles from the Soviet days, and it just fortunately didn't blow up. But had it blown up, it would have cut off electricity to the Zaporizhia plant. And nuclear power plants, they had one reactor running, the others were in sort of shutdown mode, and then they had these fuel basins that need to be cooled. And that's a real problem, that we really don't know what to do with these kind of conventional warfares that occur near nuclear power plants. And I think that reflects a certain kind of hubris and perhaps an overly optimistic attitude towards what happens in long-term human political situations, that humans do tend every number of decades to engage in warfare. And that's exactly what we're seeing in Ukraine today. So I'll leave you with these comments and we'll open it for questions. But my hope is that the Russians have been for quite some time making a beeline towards the southern nuclear power plant, yet another nuclear power plant in the south. They're getting quite near it. My hope is that they will not make that another battleground. But what we have seen is that the Russian army has been stockpiling weapons and soldiers at the Zaporozhye plant, and they did that at the Chernobyl station while they held it, knowing that the Ukrainians would not fire on them. So this is another new feature of warfare that we've never really encountered before, is using these nuclear sites as a special kind of safe haven in warfare, which I think means that they might be fought over all the more vigorously in the future. So I'll end there, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. Sorry about that hacking. That is the first time that has happened to us. So we're a bit in a bit of a scramble here in the background, trying to stop that from happening. So hopefully we've gotten rid of that person.
This is Dave, and I just want to mention, because of that, and we're familiar with other hacks that have occurred recently on Zoom sessions, we have closed the meeting, which means no new people can join. But if there are people who have not joined yet that any of our guests know of, we will be recording the session, and we will make the recording available if you send us an email. So they won't be able to join the session live, but when it's over, we'll have a recording. We'll be glad to share that. Okay, back to you, Gail.
Thanks, Dave. All right, so boy, there is so many questions I have, but I will hold back, and we're going to allow everyone else to answer questions. I just want to reintroduce myself. I'm Gail Snyder. I'm with Nuclear Energy Information Service and serve as board president. And then I'm going to have our director introduce himself really quick. Dave.
Sorry, I was frantically typing. Dave Kraft from Nuclear Energy Information Service in Chicago, and I want to thank all of you for coming and joining us tonight from all over the world, apparently. And thank you, Kate, for being such a wonderful, wonderful presenter. So back to you.
Great. And then I'm going to introduce Jan Budart, our other board member who's on this evening with us. I don't see our other board member right now, who maybe is dialing in late, or she won't be able to come in. And so Jan is going to run the chat. So she's going to explain to everyone how you can ask questions and how you can get in line to ask a question and how many questions you can ask. So Jan, you want to take it over?
Yeah, it's impossible to express the appreciation I have for Kate and the work that she has done and the fascinating books that she has written. The talk that she gave today, if you're further interested, you should read Manual for Survival. The material that she went over is elaborated in that book, and it's absolutely riveting. So this is the protocol that we follow for asking questions at Night with the Experts. The first thing is, each person, once you're called on, gets your question and a follow-up question so that you can get into a brief discussion with Kate, but not a long discussion. You get one follow-up question. If you are making a comment or a long question, or you don't need feedback from the speaker, your comment may not be more than 3 minutes. And I've got a timer on my phone so that if you go on and on, I will have to tell you that your 3 minutes are up. The third point is, please do not ask a series of questions, one question at a turn. And here's how you get into the stack. You go to the bottom of your screen, and there's a little icon there that says reactions. If you click on that, there will be a bar at the bottom that says raise hand. That is the best way to get into the stack. because then you go immediately to the top of the gallery and I can see you and you'll be in order. And so I would like it that, but if you don't do that, you can go to the chat, put your name in the chat. Well, your name will automatically be in the chat, and just put the word stack and you'll get on the stack. All right, and you will get a second chance to ask a question if it is not before 1/2 the hour and no one else has their hands raised. But we will be calling on members of the board before we go to a second round. So it looks like Connie is the first person to raise her hand. So Connie, would you go ahead and unmute and ask your question? Connie Klein from Ohio.
Thank you so much for this presentation. Despite visiting a Chernobyl event at several years ago at a Ukrainian museum, not too far from where I live, I learned something new again. But I'm confused by and I had to step away from my computer for a second because my husband just came home. But I'm confused by what transpired at that marsh or bog in the 1960s. I may have missed something, but I don't understand that.
Yeah, I was racing through it. My sense is, this is my conjecture, but I found some evidence to back this up, but I didn't find any confirming evidence because those archives are closed. But I think what the Russians were doing was testing small strategic nuclear weapons in that bombing range. There were a couple of soldiers who sued for compensation, Belarusian soldiers who said they were exposed in that bombing range to nuclear contaminants. There was some other, I had a few other clues. Some officials spoke of it in the 1990s after the Soviet Union fell apart. But the archive about Soviet nuclear testing is off limits to researchers like myself. It's in Moscow. And so I could not confirm it, but that's my conjecture. In their published report, the Soviets said that all that radiation came from global fallout, and they said it was from American bombs. Though that is also a case, like global fallout did spread radioactive cesium all over the Northern Hemisphere. And in some places it bioconcentrates, and that could have been one of the places. So rainier places that are boggy, where the radioactivity stays, towards the surface and migrates up the food chain, would be another case. So, this question of small strategic nuclear weapons is quite interesting right now. There's some conjecture that as the Soviets sort of threaten nuclear warfare, that they see, like a little continuum, and that, that small strategic nuclear weapons, that they're sort of classifying more as kind of as conventional weapons, that it's just a step towards nuclear warfare, but not the big step towards a nuclear missile. So we might be hearing more about those kinds of weapons, unfortunately, in the near future.
Thank you. Our next questioner is Arnie. He also placed his question in the chat. So go ahead, Arnie, and let's hear your question.
Yeah, thank you to NEIS, and thank you, Kate, for doing this. As I look through the list of people here on this call, certainly Maggie and I, but the vast majority of people on this call have experienced pushback from the American nuclear industry and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission when they brought concerns forward. So I'm interested about pushback that you may have received from the nuclear industry, governments, and as an academician at MIT, has MIT been supportive or not? Thank you.
Thanks, Arnie. And Arnie's someone who's really worked valiantly to bring the issues of nuclear exposure to human health to the public eye over and over again. So thank you, Arnie, for all the work you've done. And I wrote in my book about scientists who worked at the UN and consultants who worked for UN agencies who, when they, as they worked with Ukrainian, Belarusian scientists, they started to realize, oh, there was this epidemic of childhood thyroid cancer. And the UN officials said, no, that's impossible. And they said, oh, there's all these other health problems. And they said, no, that's impossible. The doses were too low. These are not, these are not the kind of symptoms we saw from Hiroshima, even though Hiroshima was one big X-ray, as opposed to chronic ingestion of radioactive contaminants 24/7, and from, children in utero all the way, life, birth to death. So these scientists, I recorded how they reported how they were threatened, their funding was pulled, some were terminated, all kinds of things happened inside the Soviet Union, but also inside the UN family of organizations. So I was not that surprised when I got that kind of treatment as soon as this book came out. The day it was published, the Journal of Radiological Protection, which doesn't really do book reviews, they published, and they certainly don't do timely ones, they published on the day my book was published, a 12-page review of my book that by a scientist, James Smith, who gets money from the European Euratom Fund. And he appears, like in 3 lines in my book, and he was really furious about my book. And he had this 12 pages that the journal gave him to rant about how terrible my book was and how wrong I was. And I read that and I was like, that's fine. All 35 people who read the Journal of Radiological Protection, no big deal. But then a guy who runs not one, but 2 kind of greenwash nonprofits that are sort of a front for nuclear energy and also petroleum industries. Michael Schellenberger, he's got a mouthpiece in Forbes. He picked it up, he started tweeting it, and it went viral. You can watch a video about it on my book's Amazon website. They did an excellent job of slander, basically. And it took a lawyer several $1,000s and about a year and a half just to get a letter published in the Journal of Radiological Protection refuting Jim Smith's claims. It was pretty easy to do, but I needed to get a platform to do that. So that amazed me. That amazed me that this supposedly nonprofit journal was so invested in this cause. And then at MIT, the Department of Nuclear Engineering, my name was Mudd, and so letters went out suggesting I be fired at MIT, and the administration, ignored that kind of thing. But the nuclear engineers are not happy that we sit in the same institution. But I consider my treatment relatively mild, Arnie, compared to what what the kinds of things you've experienced and other people in this call have experienced. You're muted.
Thank you very much, Kate. And I'd like to now make the list of people who are on the stack. Craig Schultz from Michigan, Giselle Hertzfeld, I don't know this lady, Ace Hoffman, and MC, I don't know who that is, Eric Greening, Jim Eagle, and then Mary Beth Brangan. So if you want to be on the stack, you need to let me know either through the chat or by raising your hand. And the next question comes from Craig Schultz.
Hi, and thank you, Kate, for your presentation. It was very informative. Did you find any data on how the plant and the workers were able to continue working to produce electricity for years after the disaster? That's always troubled me that they were able to continue operating so close in proximity to the disaster.
They just kept working. There's a website in Ukrainian of the union for that, of those nuclear power operators. And the website, the union puts up the number, whenever a worker dies, they put it on the website, and there's this ongoing tabulation there. And what you see is that those workers live to be about between 45 and 55. They just don't live long lives. The same with the tour guides, that run these tours. A couple of the guides I've worked with over the years have died. They're younger than I am. And so I think what it has amounted to is that these workers have worked, and they take all the precautions that one can take, but they're still working in highly radioactive conditions. And they live on average lives that are about 15 to 20 years shorter. And that's backed up by Yuri Bondazhevsky, who's been in northern Ukraine carrying out a study for the last 15 to 16 years. And that's what he finds in the area immediately south of the Chernobyl zone that's inhabited, is that adults live on average 15 years shorter than the already pretty short life of Ukrainian adults.
Is that it, Craig? Okay, so
Yes, thank you.
our next person is Giselle, and would you please unmute yourself, Giselle, and maybe give us a short introduction of yourself.
Hey, my name is Giselle Hersfeld. I work with the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center in Boulder, Colorado. And a lot of my work centers around Rocky Flats and nuclear issues in Colorado. So I wanted to start by saying thank you so much for the really informative presentation. I actually read your book, Plutopia, in an environmental history course at Reed College a few years ago. So I really admire your work, and just wanted to say that reading that book was really my first time as a young person that I really considered the idea that nuclear issues are still an issue and radioactive issues are still an issue. I feel like as young people, we often think that it's an issue of the past when it's very much not an issue of the past. So I think it very much inspired me to continue to do this work in this field, especially around Rocky Flats. And in my work, I've noticed increasingly that there's been a lot of greenwashing around nuclear power here in the US, that new nuclear power is being marketed more and more every day as a clean energy and a carbon-free energy, and something that's necessary to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And this is something that I've been very concerned about and very alarmed about. And I'm just wondering if you have any insights on the nuclear power industry in the US, and specifically, we're seeing in Ukraine how nuclear power sites are being weaponized and threatened to be weaponized. Do you see nuclear power as a national security threat here in the United States?
Yeah, I mean,
Good question.
We are getting sold, and I think it was really like a rolling ball with momentum right before the war in Ukraine, where nuclear power was going to be our future. With all, a lot of the big media endorsing it, it was getting written into the Green New Deal, et cetera, Biden endorsing it. And we've heard less about that since the war began in Ukraine, because I think it's, oh, whoops, we have these real problems. So here if there's a lot of crazy things about proposing nuclear power as a solution for climate change. The first is the economics. Solar power now is the cheapest power around. It's cheaper than gas and oil. We need to solve the problems of storage, but there's all kinds of creative solutions, pumping water up a hill and rolling it down, all kinds of things that don't involve rare metals and batteries that we can use. So I don't know why we would invest in the great expense of nuclear power when we have much cheaper options available. It takes a long time to build a nuclear power plant. It's like 15 to 20 years once you get the community to agree to host it. And when they're talking about small modular reactors, which they're talking about having on MIT campus, and I'm like, well, just leak that to the Boston Globe and see how far that, how well the Cambridge community will take that in. So these are kind of, we don't have 15 to 20 years to cut off fossil fuels. We need to do that tomorrow. So in terms of money and timing, it doesn't work, but also in terms of climate change, it doesn't work. Nuclear power plants have to be near water. We have problems with rising sea levels. We have problems with flooding rivers. France, which relies heavily on nuclear reactors, which is now divesting from their nuclear power, has had a problem in the summers because the rivers get too warm in these extra hot summers. And so they have to turn off the nuclear power plants because they're releasing all this hot water into the rivers, and they would boil their fish and all their aquatic life. When we think of the big storms, the Samuel Lawrence Foundation is here. They have the San Onofre plant, right on the Pacific Ocean, and California is zippered with them on the ocean. And we think of tsunamis and big storms on the Northeast and the Northeasters. It just doesn't make sense. I think the only way it makes sense is in terms of political economy. If you already are, have an energy company and you're supplying electricity to your customers, you can unplug the coal plant or the gas power plant and plug in a nuclear power plant without changing the grid, without changing the infrastructure. It's the path of least resistance for that. Solar power, wind power is decentralized power. The homeowner, the person who owns the land that the turbine sits on, gets a part of that energy. And so the power companies have to share the profits. And think about it, decentralized energy is also decentralized political power. It's actually a great idea for our nation, for our crazy politics and our concentration of money in a few hands to decentralize power, because we would decentralize that money, we would decentralize that political power. And I think people in their communities would feel less angry, and they would feel that they had more of a say in what happens in their communities. So it's a great idea in many ways to divest both from nuclear power and from fossil fuels. So thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Giselle. Our next questioner is Ace Hoffman. Ace, are you there and ready?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. It's a wonderful presentation, very informative, even for me. I wanted to know if the Russians were taking the spent fuel from Chernobyl in order to give it to Rosatom, who seems to need as much as they can get, and then is that fuel going to end up in America? Because as I understand it, we never stopped buying their fuel, even as the war progresses. And then the other question was about the power plant that they took over. Are they getting electricity from the Zaporizhzhia plant, or do they just plan to keep it when the war is over? Or what's the story on that? And again, it was a wonderful presentation. No wonder we were hacked.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have 20,000, there are 20,000 spent fuel rods at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And I have not read any reports that those fuel rods were taken by Russia. Russia has so much spent nuclear fuel, more than they probably know what to do with. Because every time they sell a nuclear reactor abroad, part of the deal, and this is part of the reason the Russian reactors are so attractive, is they promise to take the spent fuel back to Russia to reprocess or to store or to dispose of. And they're doing that out at the former plutonium plant in the Southern Urals, the Mayak plant. And we've seen some alarming spikes in radioactivity coming from that part of the world, having to do with pretty sloppy processing of that spent fuel. You're absolutely right, Ace, that we're encouraging Germany to stop buying gas from Russia and oil, but we are still continuing to purchase uranium from Russia. We have not stopped doing that. And that's, I think, pretty hypocritical, but that tells you how important Russian uranium is. It's a pretty major, they're the most major supplier in the world today. So I don't know how that's going to play out, but I think that's a pretty interesting denouement of this conflict, as we're starting to see our dependencies, not just for fossil fuels on Russia, but for uranium. And anybody who gets a nuclear power plant has to worry about their uranium supplies. And that means you need to have, a series of processing plants that process raw uranium into fuel rods. And not every country, is going to do that for themselves. And so this question that's coming up in the new era of climate change of power, of energy sovereignty, and like Ukraine is reaching for more nuclear power plants because they wanted to be free from Russian gas and oil. But it doesn't mean that they're necessarily free from the problem of uranium. And as Russia becomes the main uranium supplier, they hit a Klondike of uranium deposits in the 1960s. And that's 5 years later, that's when the Soviets reached parity with missile production with the US. And that's when finally we had arms control began, because the US had to realize that they were now truly threatened by the Soviet military machine. And they have a lot of uranium, and so they probably in the future will remain the major suppliers of uranium, and so that's something we have to think about.
Thank you. MC, you are next on the list. Are you here, MC? We can come back to MC if he shows up. And the person after MC is Eric Greening.
Hello, yes, I'm Eric Greening from the Mothers for Peace, San Luis Obispo County, hinterland of Diablo, where we just learned PG&E may be reversing its intent expressed over the last 5 years to do an orderly shutdown. They may be being bribed by Governor Newsom and Secretary Granholm to continue operating. Anyway, this has been a startling and amazing presentation. And my question is there any knowledge at this point, and where would we dig for it, relative to, is there a half-life, so to speak, a mean half-life of radiation reduction in imperiled or exposed ecosystems, or is that effect overwhelmed by bioconcentration up the food chain? And is there even the beginning of any study of that relative to marine ecosystems? Thank you.
I have not seen, and that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I have not seen the studies of marine ecosystems. There's been less studies like that. And the assumption is that the ocean is so large, it just diffuses everywhere. But we now know that oceans have rivers in them, and that nutrients and currents go in certain directions and not in others, much like the air. The atmosphere is very big, but there are certain currents that go reliably in the same direction, and some places get hit harder by whatever's going in those currents. In terms of ecosystems, it really depends on what contaminant we're talking about. If you're talking about plutonium, it has a half-life of 24,000 years. So that's at least 240,000 years before you would expect in a laboratory situation for that plutonium to disappear. Now, as you point out, and there's not that much plutonium, but in like in the Chernobyl accident, the plutonium landed right next to very near to the plant, but the most prevalent isotopes were strontium, radioactive strontium, and radioactive cesium, and they have a half-life of 30 years, which doesn't sound so bad, but they think that the half-life in the environment, because it's so biologically biodynamic, which means that plants and then therefore animals take up radioactive cesium and radioactive strontium because it mimics minerals that these plants and organisms need to survive. And so they keep it generating, they keep it quite fresh. And so they're thinking in Chernobyl that it'll be about 320 years before the Chernobyl zone will be safe to inhabit again. So we're talking on the level of centuries.
Okay, Jim Eagle, you are next. So you can.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and when we live right outside the town, and as we drive into Santa Fe, we can see Los Alamos National Laboratories. And I'm very concerned about and the budget is just exploding at LANL because of the new generation of nuclear weapons, the pit production in particular that they're planning on building. And I was just wondering, is there anything in the open literature that's comparable to the depth that you have done investigating Chernobyl on nuclear weapons production and the dangers that it poses to the water and the atmosphere, and also the disposal of nuclear waste eventually? New Mexico is unfortunate in that we're at the top of the list, both in nuclear weapons production and nuclear waste disposal. And so it's a real problem in this particular state. So thank you.
Yeah, there are some good histories of uranium mining. Elizabeth Fox wrote one. There are histories, I wrote a history of plutonium production in the Soviet Union. That's the book Plutopia in the Soviet Union, the United States, and in the United States, and that was in Hanford, Washington. We could have better histories of nuclear testing, and I think we really don't have one that looks at the sort of on a more global scale, and even on an American continental scale of what the health effects were from that testing. But we do see shocking, just shocking emissions from just the testing at the Nevada test site. The emissions there dwarf by an order of magnitude, 3 orders of magnitude, in fact, those emitted in Chernobyl. So what I found recently, just comparing some numbers, is that the average dose exposure for a Chernobyl liquidator is less than the exposure for the average American who was born in 1952 in the United States. Less, so that it was more dangerous to be born in the 1950s up until 1962 in the United States than to be a Chernobyl liquidator on average. And I think that helps us understand the really alarming rates of cancer among people born after 1952. The fact that sperm counts for American men are half what they were in 1945. That we have rising rates of autoimmune disorders and diseases related to autoimmune disorders like diabetes. All these kind of things we saw explode after the Chernobyl events, and these are kind of diseases of modernity, but also diseases of the Anthropocene. But some of them are very much connected to this fallout. And most countries tested nuclear weapons in other people's territories, in colonial spaces, the French in Algiers and in the South Pacific, and the British in the South Pacific and Western Australia, and the Soviets in the polar north or in Kazakhstan. But the Americans were the only country that had the temerity to open a nuclear test site right in their continental heartland, and not far from y'all there in New Mexico. Was the first site at Trinity, but also, the Nevada test site. 100 bombs were tested into the atmosphere there. And thanks, Norma, for Sarah Fox's book, Downwind, A People's History of the Nuclear West. It's a very good book. And it also deals with the medical consequences.
Follow-up, could I do a follow-up?
Sure.
Was there any books written about the Rocky Flats fire?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and because that's just up the road, that's just up the interstate from us, and we see Los Alamos turning into a new Rocky Flats for the United States.
Somebody help me. There's that book about Rocky Flats.
Full Body Burden. Full Body Burden.
Full Body Burden.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and then Shiloh Krupar is a geographer, and she, her father worked at Rocky Flats, and she has a really interesting chapter in her book. Krupar, Krupah. I think she's just written one book. You'll find it.
And Full Body Burden was written by Kristen Iverson.
Thank you. Yeah, and she grew up also in Rocky Flats, and
Yeah.
that's a shocking story that she has to tell.
Okay, our next speaker is Mary Beth Brangan. I'm assuming that James Heddle is actually Mary Beth, and so whoever is calling themselves James Heddle, please speak.
Hi, it is Mary Beth. Thanks, Jan. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you well.
Oh, thank you so much, Kate. I just loved your book. It so good. I appreciate it so much, and I appreciate NEIS for bringing you here. Um, I, I wanted to bring up the issue of the two things: dry storage. You know, the so-called dry storage is awful and horrendous and danger that the pools are. The dry storage is also an incredible vulnerability. And I noticed in some of your articles, you don't seem to acknowledge that as a problem. Uh, and I would appreciate it if you could kind of include that in your articulation of the dangers. It's an increasing problem across the United States, particularly. I also wanted to ask you, you know, if the predominant motivation for the ongoing insistence on this insane technology is coming from the military, which I think it is, because they want to continue the use of nuclear weapons, which seems so dinosaur, actually, but it still provides a huge stick. Um, and they need the nuclear power industry to affect that. How do you suggest we approach this? First of all, do you agree with that? And then, have you thought about how to counter the military's insistence?
So on your first point about dry storage, I agree with you. And I think what's really shocking and what we need to spend more time pointing out is that storage of radioactive waste in America has been privatized and this Holtec company that has had no experience in any kind of nuclear field has taken over this field. And they're cutting corners. Now they're trying to break the unions at these nuclear sites like they're doing in Plymouth, Massachusetts. In order to bring in, quickly, shoddily trained people without any security clearances, et cetera. This whole work of putting things into dry storage tanks has all kinds of problems. And I did write one editorial about the San Onofre plant and the dry storage problems that they've been having there. They have these cracked tanks that they just put in and et cetera. So I think we should start to get alarmed. I think this is the last thing that should be privatized, that this public funds that have been set aside for storage are now being sort of siphoned off by the Holtec Corporation as they cut corners and do the minimal job. And then because of the Price-Anderson Act that indemnifies these corporations, if these dry storage containers blow or break open and there's a problem, the taxpayer will pay for the cleanup. So, we're just in it over and over again, paying for this stuff. Now, your second question about nuclear power and nuclear weapons, they were, they were sort of twins that were separated at birth. Jake Hamblin has written an excellent book called The Wretched Atom about the, Atoms for Peace programs and how the US used this. First, it was just a slogan, and then it became, a series of, proliferating nuclear reactors around the world as a way to sort of, beat the Soviet propaganda thing that the Americans had the Marshall Atom. They were the only country we still are the only country to have dropped 2 nuclear weapons in warfare. And they did that with this Atoms for Peace. So if you could talk people into having, civilian power, and you can say how great it was and how useful it was for medical diagnostics and medical treatments, et cetera, then people might start to breathe more easily with the idea of nuclear weapons. I don't know if that's still the case right now. I'm not I'm a historian. I look at the past more than I look at the present. So I don't know what the Army is thinking about that. I think they're just now happily going along. Other than a short period in the 1990s, we've just had increasing budgets for research and development, even during arms control. It has never stopped. So it's just like status quo as far as I'm concerned.
Ernest Moniz, former secretary of he's come out and just absolutely emphasized the necessity of nuclear power in order for the nuclear weapons program to continue. And he's been joined by others voices, and I think it was 2017 when his institute outlined a program to push for the resumption of the nuclear power infrastructure and so on, because of that reason. And so that's why I believe Ernest.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Infrastructure
And it's
labor
because of the infrastructure and the labor that they need that's required. They can't, I guess it just, like you say, it's twins separated at birth. It was
Yeah.
really,
And, you know, and here's the problem. Somebody's pointing out that Moniz comes from MIT, where I teach, and he was president for a while, if I'm correct. But this is the problem we're having at MIT is they don't have any undergrads who want to study nuclear engineering. So here we have this aging set of employees and operators and technicians. It's also very hard to get any radiation monitors. And you know, nuclear physicists who will work on you know, questions of the environment, questions of health. So in terms of you know, education, young people aren't interested in this topic, and so who's gonna operate and run these things?
yeah, I think
I
that's
mean, we're just gonna get guys out of the nuclear navy, I think is, you know, maybe what, and they have no choice but to learn this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to move on, Mary Beth, if you'll forgive me. Now, Norma's had her hand up for a long time, but Mitchell Marcus was in first. Mitchell Marique was in first. And so I'm going to call on him, and then Norma, you're after Mitchell, and then Yoshi Sagawa will be after Norma. So Mitchell, would you please ask your question and unmute yourself if you need to? I don't see you here.
Oh, I guess it wasn't really a question. It was just you know, a statement that I was making. I don't know if Kate had noticed that was in the news lately, that Russia was offering to sell Ukraine the electricity from the nuclear power plant that they seized, you know, within Ukraine. And Ukraine saying that, oh, well, you know, we're planning on building 5 new reactors from Westinghouse, you know, 2 at Khmelnytsky and, you know, 3 at the other existing sites. And so I don't know if she heard that or not. So
yeah, those plans to build new reactors in Ukraine are longstanding plans. Belarus is also building its first nuclear power reactor. In the one remaining part of Belarus that didn't get zapped by the Chernobyl accident, they're putting up in the northwest corner on the border with Lithuania. So hoping that the Lithuanians will get zapped if they have an accident there. So there is this, Estonia is talking about nuclear power very seriously. So all of these former Soviet republics are deeply invested in trying to gain energy sovereignty. And they think that the only way they can do that is through nuclear power. And that's very old school thinking. We did some with a colleague here at Earth and Planetary Sciences, Susan Solomon. We did the math and learned that Ukraine has, if they switched to energy and solar, they would have 150% of the nuclear power that they have now. They have, you know, fantastic. It's a very sunny and very windy country. They have fantastic possibilities for renewables, but they just, you know, as I say, that's just old school thinking. You know, we got a big grid. We're used to having big centralized power, and they're learning right now just how easy it is when you have big centralized power, how easy it is for an army to come in and capture that. It's like a chessboard. You capture the king, the game is up. It would be very hard to capture, you know, thousands of solar panels all over the country and tens of thousands of wind turbines. It's just so easy to debilitate a country when they have centralized power.
Okay, Norma, would you unmute, please, and ask your question?
Hi, Nora. It's great to see you.
Yeah.
Okay.
wonderful to have you here. So I was translating a question for a Japanese participant. It actually relates closely, I think, to Mr. Segawa's question. It's asking you to compare Fukushima and Chernobyl contamination. And it's a particularly pointed issue right now because yesterday or today, our time, was the opening day of a trial in which 6 young Japanese who were growing up in Fukushima as children developed thyroid cancer, and they are taking TEPCO to court. And of course, one of the standard responses will be, but we got so much less than Chernobyl. Anyway, they're very brave young people, and it's a very emotional and significant moment.
Mm-hmm. You know, I don't know what else to make of this rash epidemic of thyroid cancers in Japan. You know, what's it about if it's not about Fukushima? You know, I think it's so unfortunate that sick individuals who are already dealing with treatment and the cost and the trials of treatment have to then take companies and governments to court and go through that. It should be on, you know, if there's an epidemic of new cancers, it should be on the government's responsibility to figure out what those contaminants are and what the cause of that is. But we usually do it the other way around, and we leave it to the people who are already victims and often have far fewer facilities to deal with this problem. But it seems like, you know, I haven't done any, you know, I don't speak Japanese, so I did not delve deeply into the Fukushima issue because I like to do my research on the ground, and I like to do it in languages that I can understand. But the 2 biologists I worked with, Tim Musso and Anders Moeller, have been doing a cross study comparison between Fukushima and Chernobyl. And what they seem to find is very similar effects in terms of the reaction among the birds, insects, the flora of these 2 areas. They see quite similar responses. You know, in the hotter areas, a major decline in the number of birds and insects, you know, sort of, you know, cascades of extinction. And that it's very patchy. There are some places that are relatively clean that might be, you know, inside the zone, and other areas that are quite dirty, they're outside the zone. And that these are dynamic regions, that they're moving around. They move with wind, they move with water, they move with humans moving things around. So I would be really surprised if those thyroid cancers weren't somehow related to Fukushima.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Okay, Yoshi, you're up next. Could we hear your question, please?
I'm sorry, I just writing in the chat box, but so UNSCARE is one of the organization of the United Nations publishes recent reports, and UNSCARE denies that the exposure from Fukushima nuclear plant is the cause of too many thyroid cancer in young people in Fukushima Prefecture. And the Japanese government and TEPCO uses UNSCARE reports for their scientific reason. And I think IAEA and other organizations of UN said similar statements in the early stage in Chernobyl, and they can't deny. But what do you think about such UNSCARE or IAEA?
Well, I worked in the archives of both of those institutions, and the guy who was the head of UNSCARE was actually extremely helpful in pointing out to me all kinds of things. One is that UNSCARE, and this became quite clear from their archives too, UNSCEAR is not an organization that's independent from the IEA. In fact, the IEA is a far richer organization, and it finances UNSCEAR. It lends UNSCEAR staff. And, it sort of puts people over on retainers. And in the 1980s, when they were working on the Chernobyl problem, and I was reading through their archives, they had this side discussion that said, well, UNSCEAR really is pretty much a department of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Why don't we just put it in there administratively? And the International Atomic Energy Agency folks said, oh no, we can't do that, because then people would think that you're not an independent body of scientists commenting. They would think that you're part of us, and everybody knows that we're a nuclear lobby. So there's this fiction that UNSCEAR is somehow, I don't know, outside the fray, but they're not. They're a subordinate entity to, or at least they were in the 80s and 90s, to the International Atomic Energy Agency. Now, the International Atomic Energy Agency worked really hard to fight the World Health Organization during the Chernobyl controversy. Like, who's gonna make assessments about Chernobyl's health impacts? The World Health Organization said, well, of course we should do it. We're the health people. And the IEA said, no, we should do it. We're the nuclear people. And they had a big fights. I mean, angry fights, like mean letters going to the World Health Organization. I didn't see what the IEA got back, because the IEA was not very forthcoming with their correspondence. But the IEA won. They have far more money. They have they're higher on the hierarchy in the UN family of organizations, and they soundly defeated the World Health Organization. And then I saw them, as UNSCEAR took in the research on Chernobyl, as they were making their big assessment that became the Chernobyl Forum report. They get all these reports from the Belarusian and Ukrainian scientists that are right there on the ground, the ones who are doing all this research and treating people, and they take it and they throw it out. They started with a 600-page compendium, and they got it down to 300 pages and only included, they said, oh, this Ukrainian and Belarusian stuff it doesn't match Western scientific protocols. It's, junk science, all this kind of stuff. They just slandered it and threw it out. And they happened to throw out anything that sounded negative. And what they kept saying is like, listen, we've got the Hiroshima studies. They're saying just what they're saying in Fukushima. These doses people are getting are too low to have caused any of these health problems people are reporting. They must be getting it because they're anxious. It must be anxiety from radiophobia, and they just kept repeating that until it stuck. So that the UN still reports that 54 people died from Chernobyl, just an astounding number. If you spend 2 weeks in Ukraine, you'll meet 54 people with dead relatives who were exposed, from Chernobyl.
Thank you. Our list now is Kate, Gail Snyder, John LaForge, and David Kraft. And we only have 10 minutes left unless Kate is willing to go over time. And I don't know if you feel that you want to, if you have other assignments. What do you say, Kate?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, so our next speaker is Kate, and we don't know her last name. Kate, unmute yourself and ask your question about the Navajo.
I'm sorry, and I came in very late. I used to work on the Navajo reservation, and I'm aware that I don't know if it's active uranium mining anymore. I believe some of it was through Peabody Coal Company, but I wondered if we aren't getting any of that uranium from our indigenous peoples.
Yeah, I mean, again, other people have done this work more closely, but from what I understand is there was a real problem with, the health of uranium miners. but also everybody in the community, because those tailings were used, they're all over the place. They're used to make buildings. They're all over people's dwellings as they drag the dust comes in to the household. It's on the couch, it's in the bed sheets, it's in the food, it's in the schoolyards. So the health problems that you see in those places probably have a lot to do with uranium. And there's a very good historian, Gabriel Hecht at Stanford University, who wrote about this, how all throughout the Cold War, every facet of the nuclear cycle was deemed nuclear except uranium mining, which there was no nuclear regulation, special regulation at all for uranium mining. They were just regular miners. And as she points out, most uranium miners were sort of colonized people, Navajo or just regular, working class miners. And a lot of people mined in South Africa and in the Congo were African miners. And nobody internationally ever bothered to make any regulations about what kind of exposures, or to monitor these people, or to, in terms of their exposures, like to have badges that look at exposures. So like the stories from the Navajo mines is like the miners would, they'd be down underground, it's hot down there, they'd put a cup under dripping, where water was dripping, and then they drink that nice cold water coming down the ground that, was going right through the uranium mine.
And it's a big problem now, but there's no, what's the right word?
No epidemiology on that.
What's that?
No epidemiology, no one tracing that.
Well, there's nobody who's going to stand up and do anything about it. There's no ownership.
Yeah. Sort of an environmental justice problem.
Yeah. Thank you.
Gail, you're next. Please unmute and ask your question.
So I wanted to ask you to maybe elaborate on problems with World Health Organization reports, kind of like Unscare. Recently, I gave testimony at a subject matter hearing in Illinois before the House, a committee of the House of Representatives about a nuclear issue, and I got in kind of a debate with an MIT professor who was on the opposing side, and he said to me, well, how many people died in Fukushima? And I thought, oh, what's he baiting me for? This wasn't even part of what we were talking about. And I said, well, a lot of people, because I didn't want to say to him, well, let's wait a little while and see all the cancers come in. And I said, well, they said, only 50 some people died in Chernobyl, but look at how many people had thyroid cancers and everything in Belarus. And, and he acquiesced. He did say about Chernobyl, yes, there were only so many, but, obviously there was more going on there. But this is the second time I've heard people say the world, because then he got to the point he wanted to make, is that the World Health Organization says that nobody died in Fukushima. This is the second time I've had somebody say that to me. So this is a big talking point on the pro-nuclear side. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are with the World Health Organization's data and their conclusions, and how that, that gets thrown around, and people just, when you're talking to a state legislator and you quote the World Health Organization, they take it as, solid fact to not be questioned.
What I learned working through the World Health Organization and I worked through 5 UN agency files related to Chernobyl, is that the UN is a political institution, and they service their clients, and their clients are these states. And the bigger the state, the more they want to service them. So, on the Chernobyl desk, the diplomats kept asking, well, about Chernobyl, they like, well, what do the Americans say? And they would have to turn, and what do the Soviets say? And so if Japan can really lean on the World Health Organization so that there is only 1 reported death or 0 reported deaths. Now, as I say, I haven't really followed the Fukushima, fallout question very strongly. Like Norma, if she's still on the call, she might be able to tell us more about how many reported deaths. But what I found amazing working my way through the Chernobyl records is that, the official number is 54 dead. But in Ukraine alone, 35,000 women get compensation because their husbands died from a Chernobyl-related cause. Now, men in the prime of their life were the least likely to die. So that number only includes men in the prime of their life, not women or children. So off the record, the Ukrainian health officials, they said in 2016, we think about 150,000 Ukrainians have died. Now, Ukraine got only 20% of the Chernobyl fallout. Most of it went to Belarus and Western Russia, and those countries have published absolutely no reports, nothing, like we could not find anything. So 135,000 is the absolute minimum that we can prove. 150,000 is just probably Ukraine's number. And then we could probably double or triple that for each of Belarus and Russia, if it corresponds with the fallout numbers. So we're getting close to Greenpeace's number of about 900,000. Norma, do you have any numbers on Fukushima? And why were we only talking about deaths? It's really awful to get sick and to spend your life with chronic illness. It's like, I don't know why we only care about dead people. But yeah, Norma.
I know. I mean, as a young woman plaintiff who was the only one so far on the opening day of the trial to speak, she is, I mean, people tend to think of thyroid cancer as, some people say, a good cancer. If you have to get one.
Right.
Well, she has metastasis to the lungs. So there's nothing wonderful about that. The numbers are, there are what, 2 workers early on who were, they're not dead. There's so much we don't know about worker death because there's such reluctance to acknowledge it. I mean, I know about some of them, but they're not officially recognized as caused by Fukushima, but there were very severe accidents of workers standing and getting stuck in contaminated water, of someone who did die, who fell into one of those tanks.
Wow.
But then there related deaths. That's another whole category, and that, I think this is actually pretty significant, but I don't want to feed the radiophobia is everything ideology. But of the 3 major prefectures affected by the earthquake, tsunami, and the nuclear disaster, the suicide rates in the ones without the immediate nuclear disaster have gone down progressively over the years. In Fukushima, the suicide rates continue to go up. I mean, I think everyone will agree that living with a major nuclear disaster is not good for your psyche, and that stress is not good for your health, but it's egregious to substitute anxiety for all ills. But there is also severe anxiety, obviously, going on, particularly because health effects are unrecognized. There's something about having so much illness around and being told, no, the thyroid experts in Japan say, it is a cluster, it's on a different order of magnitude from what we've had, but there's no reason we can really relate it to the nuclear disaster. So in the face of such denialism, it's hard to get an accurate count, how hard it would be under any circumstances of death.
In the sort of plutonium irradiated zones in Siberia, the Russian doctors there did work on suicide because they find that radiation is extremely sensitive, that neurons, the neurological system is extremely sensitive to radiation. And they connected that to this really high numbers of suicides, both in places where people didn't know that they were irradiated because they were living in these quietly contaminated zones from plutonium production. And they also noticed the same phenomenon in Chernobyl. So there might be something more than just anxiety about this.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks very much for these questions and answers. And John LaForge is up next. John, go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks, Jen. And thanks, Kate, for your presentation. I put in the chat a reference to a new article that's been published in a peer-reviewed journal called Cancer Treatment and Research Communications by Dr. Chris Busby. And it does directly speak to this question we've heard several times tonight about how the IAEA and the unscarred people say those doses were too small to cause these illnesses. As Busby has proven many times now, again with this latest paper, the risk model is artificially, and it was deliberately established so that the industry could tell us exactly what it's saying, that the doses are too low, you need a bigger dose to have these illnesses. What Busby has shown is that chronic low dose exposure, especially to internal emitters, is causing this cancer epidemic, this cancer plague around the world. So I recommend, it's a little technical, the article, but it's worth reading, and people in this group can sure handle the technical nature of it. My question is, I wanted to ask Kate to repeat what you said about the Chernobyl liquidators and their body burden of radiation compared to people in the US born since 1952. Is that in your book?
No, I just came across that fact not long ago when I was writing something else, and I just compared, with the estimated dose. Owen Hoffman, they were doing these dose reconstructions. The National Cancer Institute did dose reconstructions in the 1990s, and then I just looked up the average estimated liquidator dose, and it was lower.
Amazing. Thanks. That's all I had, Jan.
I keep muting myself because I'm having coughing. Steve Chappelle, would you please unmute and ask your question? Steve, are you? Oh, yeah,
Hi,
there we go.
I'm here.
Mhm.
Say, could you talk about the present time for a second? It would appear that Bill Gates has put in several $100 million for marketing, and of course has started a major distributed nuclear company. Can you speak to that seems like the height of madness to distribute small nuclear plants around the United States, and now to pay with his enormous, and then people like Bill Gates, right? He was pretty good around COVID. But it seems pretty wild. Is there a connection with him and Monitz? And what do you think about all of that distributed nuclear, if I'm saying it correctly? Thank you. Steve Jobs in California with Samuel Lawrence Foundation.
Yeah, I don't know what they're thinking. I mean, Jobs is selling fusion reactors, which is like a miraculous technology that's always 10 years away, no matter what decade you're in. They first started talking about it in 1950. The Soviets made a great film about it in 1961, and it was just on the horizon. It's called 9 Days in One Life. But I don't know. I mean, I think Gates is probably genuinely concerned about climate change, and this is something he thinks he can do, is throw a lot of money and get a safe, form of nuclear energy. And since fusion, if it were to work, it's supposedly safe. I guess that's what he's trying to do. But
yeah, I don't think Gates is into fusion exactly.
That was my understanding, that he was financing these fusion research too. And the small modular reactors, the idea is if there's an accident, it's a small accident, but it's in a heavily populated place. So, we have, I don't know how you do those casualty numbers.
Okay. And do you think there's any safe place in America if there were like an all-out nuclear war? It used to be Montana, and then they put the missiles into Montana, right? The ICBMs. Is that a little far afield, or have you thought about?
I think we just would have a nuclear winter situation. There'd be no safe place on Earth.
And how likely do you think the Russians will use a tactical weapon? Do you have any backstory on that?
No, I just read some analysis that they sort of are are thinking that a tactical nuclear weapon isn't really a nuclear weapon. You know,
Right.
they've downgraded it so that they might be used. But what they're threatening to do is to attack some Western country. I guess we could probably imagine be the United States. But you know, I don't. And the diplomat who resigned dramatically this week was talking about how horrified he was about his fellow Russian diplomats who were very blithely talking about, well, we'll just toss one nuclear weapon at them and they'll all get down on their knees and beg for a surrender.
Yeah.
But I mean, I would like to remind everybody, and I'm sure this group is well aware, that the only country in the world to have used nuclear weapons in warfare is the United States, and that the Soviets in the past have shown great restraint. Like they're the ones who backed down in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Otherwise, we would have had a terrible disaster in 1962. So, we focus a lot on one man, on Putin. But I mean, I think I kind of think of this as a climate war, that Russians have 8 more years to sell their oil and their coal, and then they're kind of their biggest 54% of their export economy, 54% of their revenue is gone. So Ukraine has a breadbasket. They have a lot of wheat. They have nitrogen fertilizer plants. They have those big ports that ship wheat all around the world. So I think that's why they took it. And that there's a bigger sort of structural reason for this war that I think we should focus on, more than the crazy leader stuff.
By the way, brilliant book and brilliant discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
The next person on our list is David Kraft, and after him, I think we ought to give Kevin a chance to say something, and also Bart Ziegler wants to make a contribution, and Judith Moling. So it's already 8 minutes past our time, and I don't know how tired Kate is getting, but we can call this a halt whenever you are too.
Why don't we just take these last questions all together, and then we can.
Okay, so it's David Kraft, Kevin, if he wants to, and Bart, and Judith. I think it's Bart. It says Samuel Lawrence Foundation. I think it's Bart.
Yeah, let me go first, David, because you should really close the meeting out with this has been tremendous. I mean, we owe it to your group for putting this together. And Kate, just wanted to say that Congressman Levin, who represents us, with the help of Roger Johnson and a couple other people, pushed through the possibility of the National Academy of Sciences to do a cancer cluster study around San Onofre and 6 other places.
Wow, fantastic.
If you read the syntax, it's a possibility of a cancer cluster study. And I guess I didn't have a question about that, but you're bringing up the fact that, suicides and illnesses, chronic illnesses are just going to be, you're right. So and also I'm so grateful to you for bringing up the context of the war. The real war is not the boogeyman, necessarily Putin. Boogeyman he is, but the fact that all these oil companies are in collusion together. And Levin brought that up, that the oil companies have never made more big profits than ever before. And then also, is there anything, so you have so many people in the war zone, is there anything that we can do as a collective group that just, essentially adores your pioneering, your legendary pioneering in this whole? Can we do anything in Ukraine to help?
Okay, I think we're going to consolidate the questions. So let's have David Kraft come up with his. David.
Well, I'm not sure if that was a consolidation, but it was a follow-up on the discussion between Gail and Kate that I wanted to add to this idea. And Kate, you put it most succinctly, that why are we always just talking about death? And I'll just do a quick story and then go to where I want to head with this. I'm forever grateful for my friend and colleague Kevin Camps and his ex-wife Gabriela Bulashova, who brought 8 kids over from the Chernobyl Children's Project And they were examined here in, I think it was Western Michigan University. Every one of them had a very unique visual handicap. And I know this, I shouldn't say this in public, but did get a chance to see every one of the charts, and every one of the charts said condition consistent with the effects of ionizing radiation. So I bring that up in the idea that you're right, we shouldn't only be talking about death. I would recommend people check out the Chernobyl Children's Project and see all the various things they've done over the years, which talk about non-death related stuff. Another is the Academy Award winning short, Chernobyl Heart, which is only 45 minutes long, but it also talks about, you know, the fact that Belarusian kids are going to die because they couldn't get a $200 goddamn patch on their heart. We need to emphasize that it's bigger than just death, and make that a kind of a cornerstone of our rebuttals in some ways. So that's just the observational part, and maybe Kevin will say more about that in a minute. Just a quickie though, have you seen, and if you would comment on the movie The Battle of Chernobyl, which is available on YouTube? It's been around for quite a long time. So I'm done.
Oh, okay. So let's go to Kevin. Kevin.
Hello, sorry.
Hi.
Thank you so much, NEIS and Kate, for an amazing event. The feeling is mutual, Dave. I mean, our bond deepened so much with those kids from Belarus. And one of the, I don't know, one of the things that sticks in my craw is when the other side says, oh, thyroid cancer is treatable. Well, not in Belarus, not very easily, unless you're rich. And so the Irish Chernobyl Children's Project has just worked miracles on the ground in Belarus. I have a million things to ask, but the one that I guess I'll bring up is back in January of 2020, a Chernobyl worker approached us and offered to do a briefing, and a number of people attended. And that worker has asked for us to protect their anonymity. But what was revealed was that, you know, Holtec is in charge of the high-level radioactive waste management at Chernobyl and has really been screwing up majorly for years. And one of the things that was revealed was that Holtec had essentially abandoned its duty at Chernobyl for a long period of time, was down to a single supervisor on site to manage the high-level radioactive waste from 4 reactors, right? Or 3 at least, not the melted down one, the destroyed one. But I guess one takeaway from that, given the current war, is, you know, Holtec had just begun the transfer operations of pool to dry cast storage into a flawed dry cast storage facility at Chernobyl. And Holtec wasn't solely responsible. Areva made the first mistakes. Holtec took over after that and made more mistakes. And the whistleblower said that the facility should have been knocked down and they should have started over from scratch. It's so flawed. But Holtec screw-ups created the situation where the pools are still full of high-level waste at Chernobyl. So when the Russian military seized the plant, those pools should have been emptied. There should have been no risk of, you know, a mega catastrophe at Chernobyl because of loss of electricity during the seizure. So I just wanted to say thanks, Kate, for bringing up Holtec. We're fighting them, trying to stop them from taking over at Palisades. We're fighting them in New Mexico, trying to stop them from building the consolidated interim storage facility. I mean, could you imagine Holtec being in charge of barge shipments of high-level waste on Lake Michigan from Palisades up to the Port of Muskegon? So we really have a fight on our hands. But I guess putting that out there, I do have notes from that briefing. If people are interested, I can share them with you. I guess the one question I'll ask Kate, Yablokov's book from 2004, you gave the figure of 900,000 dead attributable to Chernobyl. And I just wanted to point out that Yablokov, Nestorenko, and Nestorenko also gave a figure of close to 1 million deaths, and just between the years of 86 to 2004. And the question that Arnie asked early, what about pushback? The executive director of the New York Academy Press, which published the Yablokov book in English, was quickly fired, essentially, under pressure from the nuclear industry. So I just wanted to share that. having published that book, for having dared publish that book in the English language. Thanks.
And then they renounced it.
Yeah. And another thing about that book is people say, well, it's all anecdotal. Well, you know, when you have 1,000 anecdotes, you've got data. Judith, you're going to be the last person, I believe, to ask a question, and it's going to be part of this consolidation. So go ahead and ask your question.
Well, I really wanted to go back to Rocky Flats that we talked about earlier, and to ask, I suppose I could ask the question, have you read Leroy Moore's book? People and Plutonium Don't Mix. It's outstanding, and I highly recommend it. And if you write to us, we'll send you a copy. And it'd be wonderful, Kate, if you were to read it. And I thank you so much for this remarkable presentation and your answers to all of everybody's questions. Outstanding. So thank you very much.
Put your data in the chat, please, for asking for the book.
Okay.
Yeah, please do that. Well, Giselle did it. She said the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center.
Oh, good. Thanks,
Yeah.
Giselle.
Okay. Do you want to respond to this so-called consolidation of questions, Kate? And then we'll close off.
Yeah, I can respond quickly. Great news, Bart, that there's possibility of a study, and so there's going to be a lot of circumscribers who come in and say, well, we can only take in the effects proved from the Hiroshima studies, the gold standard, blah, blah, blah. I would push back against that. I would push back against using the Hiroshima and Nagasaki studies dose reference data, because that is one big X-ray. They did not count fallout. There was fallout in Japan, but they did not count it in the study. They started that study. They only started it in 1950. That's when they started funding it. Then they started gathering data in the following years. So 10 years could pass before they asked somebody, where were you standing when the bomb went off? And that's how they reconstructed the dose. They had no measurements. The Japanese physicists had taken measurements. The US Army confiscated that data, and it's never been seen again. So that study should not be the baseline. And that's the tricky thing. So there's a very good in-work study that was done a few years ago of 300,000 nuclear plant workers in Great Britain, France, and the United States. That study should be the reference point, and so that you can get them to widen, especially the health effects. And that study is just of mostly men nuclear plant operators in the prime of their life. So that doesn't include children, doesn't include in utero exposures. That story about the kids all had vision problems is, over and over again, my neighbor adopted 2 boys from Ukraine. It turns out by the time they were teenagers, one is very hearing impaired, and the other one, it turns out, only had 1 kidney, and just born that way. But so these, born with birth defects, just from somewhere in Ukraine, they don't know where. But these stories happen over and over again. So that to consider, non-lethal effects like chronic illnesses, that if you look at the studies that I have in my book, a lot of that material Yablokov drew on. That was not anecdotal material. Those were from long-standing studies that, especially the Belarusian Academy of Science that Nestorenko oversaw. They started carrying out those studies in 1986. They'd set up case controls, and they just followed communities, really close, really on the ground studies, amazing work. Almost none of it's been translated, and it's just sitting there in the archives in Belarus. So that's all great stuff. In terms of Holtec, I'm so grateful that those of you are campaigning against Holtec. I think there should be a more universal campaign to sort of neutralize this idea that you privatize dealing with waste, radioactive waste. That should stay in the public entity. No one should make profits from storage of nuclear waste. They're of course going to cut corners. And when they cut corners, we're all going to pay for it eventually. That just seems like just common sense. And I think if the public were to learn more about not just Holtec as the villain, but like the whole concept of privatizing the storage of nuclear waste, that's insane with public funds. Like, that's taking neoliberalism way too far. Yeah, so thank you for the book. I'll take a look at it. That sounds really interesting. And thank you, everyone. This has been a really interesting evening for me too. Much better than hearing myself talk. So thank you for like what an amazing group of people on this call. Thanks for coming.
And thank you so much for staying over this way. And we really appreciate and hope for the best. I'm glad to hear that your parents are doing well. And it was really nice to have you in Chicago. Not that,
the big city. Yes, thank you, everyone. Have a good night, late afternoon, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
We're not quite finished yet.
Oh, we're not finished yet.
Gail?
Yeah, I just want to turn that over to you, Dave. So go ahead.
Oh, okay. I get to do the housekeeping at the end here, but again, I also want to thank you profusely for being a guest tonight and for the incredible information you shared with everybody. The good news is we did tape it. There was a little glitch because of those, whatever they were, pseudo hacks. We're not quite sure yet what they were. So not everything did get recorded. There might be a few minutes that we missed, but there is a recording. We will have it edited and we will make it available. And we'd also like to remind people that you have the ability to save the chat. And there's a wealth of information in tonight's chat box. So I strongly encourage you to do it if you know how. If you don't know how, you can send NEIS an email and we will send it to you. It'll come to you in a text file, but there are a lot of links and books and all kinds of resources in tonight's chat. So we urge you to save that. The other thing I'm really glad to say is it's almost like we're on a roll here because Kate's presentation is going to be followed up in the next few months by Michael Schneider of France, who does the World Nuclear Report every year. And Cindy Folkers of Beyond Nuclear is going to be talking about radiation. So this is really going to be kind of the trifecta for those of you who are regulars on this program. And it's always the last Thursday of each month, 7 o'clock Central Time. We are very pleased and grateful that those of you who are calling in from Japan stayed with us tonight. This is quite an international gathering we've had this evening, and we're grateful to have you on board as well. So again, thank you, Kate. I want to thank everyone who joined us tonight, and we hope that we will be seeing you at our future events on the last Thursday of each month for Night with the Experts.
Could I just say one thing? Michael Schneider will be our speaker next month.
There you have it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, everyone. And Kate, if you could just stay on as everyone else signs off and we could just chat with you a minute before we officially end with you. Thank you, everyone.